All right, teammates, we are back once again. If this is your first time listening to the Move Swiftly podcast, welcome to the number one show on innovative teamwork. Great to have you. Looking forward to having you back for more. To my regular listeners, you hit the play button. You know what's going down. You know how we roll here. Whether it's whatever the obstacle is, whatever the challenge is, whatever it is you may be going through, we are here to indirectly tell you you are not going through it alone. Today, I have a Christian Muntean, and let me tell you, it's great. And the cool thing about the world we live in now is you have your opportunity to meet people that you relate to, and you don't necessarily have to meet them in person physically. When you hear someone speak, when you hear what they're all about, you have opportunities to be very relatable, and that gives you kind of another reason, a platform or a way to springboard some of the things that you want to do with your life positively. So with Christian, he, like me, comes from the fitness world and is really into self-development. He has a company named Train to Lead. So before I make the intro too long, Christian, welcome to the show. How are you?
Yeah, thank you. I'm doing great. It's good to be here.
Yeah, so let's just get started, man, because like I had mentioned in the intro, you have a similar background to me in regards to, kind of working in the fitness world and then using some of those lessons and aligning them with consulting and aligning them with a lot of business leaders and things like that. So, kind of give us a little bit about your background, kind of how you grew up and stuff like that, and we'll just kind of go from there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I grew up in Anchorage, Alaska, so it was a little bit of a different experience, I guess,
Yes,
from
yes. So,
a
well,
lot
actually,
of
let me let the listeners know. This is number two, guys. I might have to go make a trip out there, but this is the second
yeah, yeah,
from
definitely.
Alaska that has been on this podcast.
But a lot of my background was involved in athletics just as a student.
Hmm.
And um in terms of how I got to where I'm at right now, the short version of the story is I started to get involved in service work out of high school, and that
Hmm.
evolved into working in international disaster relief
Yes.
development work. So I was working in different places like the Balkans and the Middle East and Africa and Indonesia and so on. And I began to see that we could be in very well-funded projects in safe areas, secure areas.
Yes.
And if the team wasn't led well or we didn't get along with each other well, it was very hard to do our projects. It was very hard to be successful, and it was just a rough experience. On the
Hmm.
other hand, you could be working in a project that was underfunded and in an insecure area where there's active conflict or, a new disaster, and it was hard. But if things were led well and the team got along well, it was actually a very positive experience
Hmm.
and you could accomplish a lot. So I thought our work was important, and I thought a lot of things seem to hinge around leadership and team dynamics. And so I became really interested in that. So that led to graduate work and over time led to consulting, which I've done now for over 20 years.
Hmm.
But all along the way, I've had this interest in athletics and fitness.
Hmm.
And so for about 12 years, I was a strength and conditioning instructor at a gym, and just as an aside thing.
Hmm.
And one day, as I was driving home, I thought, why is it that a coach or a trainer can
Yes.
take an athlete and prepare them for their event to the day? Like we can precisely develop a training program for them to peak out at their highest level. But for leaders, it's always left up to chance. It's like, here's a bunch of ideas, here's some books, we'll send you to some
Hmm.
training workshops. Now don't screw up. And that's like the average sort of
Yes.
prep for promotion.
Right.
And I thought it has to be better than that. And so I began to look at how we actually sort of the models that trainers use to prepare athletes. And
Hmm.
I wondered if there was an overlay between that and leadership. And it turned out there was. So that's where my book,
Hmm.
Train to Lead, came out of that.
Yes. Now, I do like I said, I do want to hear more about the transition and the specifics about the transition from the athletics world to the leadership world. But before we go there, can you give us some specific examples of what you were doing? Like, what were the projects all about when you were helping with the relief and certain things? Because again,
Yeah.
I live out here in South Florida. I mean, I moved out here actually the year of Hurricane Irma. And I moved from Maryland. When I started to see the damage and the realities of, hey, Florida is a great place to live, but there's a lot of difficult things. There's a lot of things you have to be prepared for. You just never
Right.
know when you're going to need that kind of work. And the fact that you actually built the business from that perspective, what were some of those things that you learned, or when there's some things that you had to actually do during those times that made you say,
Yeah.
this is a,
Well, I think like a lot of, and this is relatively common in the disaster relief space. You know, you don't know what you're going to get thrown into or
yeah.
what you're going to have to deal with responsibility wise. So you end up getting a lot of experience and opportunity and exposure that
Mhm.
probably wouldn't be available to most people just because you happen to be there and a job needs to get done.
Yes.
In Kosovo, I was originally hired because I had a background working in mental health. I was originally hired to develop, this was pre 9/11. So
Hmm.
terms like PTSD weren't common. So we used terms like war trauma and
Hmm.
we had other language that we used. But I was hired to develop therapeutic preschool programs because in Kosovo, it had been one of the most, I guess, if you want to call it, successful ethnic cleansings
Hmm.
in the world in contemporary history. And so it was traumatic. It was awful for the Albanian population as they were coming back. So we were developing programs for that. I was
Now,
in that for a while.
for adults though, right? Like you were creating like a preschool
No, they brought me over to do it for kids.
kids for the kids. Okay, right. Because they
Yeah, yeah.
adults. I got you.
The adults probably needed it more,
Yeah,
in
that's
my
what I'm
opinion.
saying. Like they probably would need it.
Yeah. But the funding was for the kids.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so where that's what I was originally brought over for. But where I actually was moved um, was over to working with reconstruction. So most of my time there, I oversaw the reconstruction of 15
Mhm.
villages. And because about 80 to 90% of all of the homes had been destroyed or damaged in the war. And so there was just most of the work was about rebuilding homes and getting people back
Right.
into homes.
Right.
And so that's what I did there.
Mhm.
Uh, Different projects, and I worked in Sudan, and the main thing that I did there was research into peace building efforts.
Mhm.
Um, there was a chance for peace to break out and for something to be resolved in the Civil War at that time. And so I was there to provide advice to our agency, which was a medical agency, about how they could contribute to peace building.
Right.
Indonesia after the tsunami. Mostly I was there to help advise on directing funding and where, because there was so much money that kind of was
Mhm.
produced, where can you put it appropriately?
Right.
And we ended up getting involved in funding shipbuilding and like fishing boats, large fishing vessels, because
Wow.
it could put a lot of people back to work. So there was a lot of variety
Yeah.
in that. I think one of the lessons was I had a resume and I had qualifications,
Mhm.
but the truth was is I just wasn't prepared for all of the stuff that I ended up being thrown into.
Exactly.
And so it was a very quick learning curve and you're learning on when you led well, other people benefited, but if you made mistakes or you got caught up in your own ego or didn't see something, other people paid for that. And that really started to um like I felt impacted by that. Like, oh,
Yes.
like people are really impact like their futures
Exactly.
here.
And
I
what's
have some
crazy
impact
too,
on.
and I don't mean to cut you off on there, but I want to make sure this point gets emphasized for the listeners, is these were small things. These were maybe just, building a boat. These were maybe just a curriculum that will help the future. These were really small things that you would never realize would feel such a huge need for people that actually have gone through some traumatic stuff. And when you are living your, and when you've been blessed enough to be in a position where you realize, hey, these small things that you can do, these very, very tiny things that you can do, can change a family's entire life, can change the trajectory of their
Yeah.
life. It's amazing. And that leads you to a place where, hey, man, leadership is a completely different thing than what they teach you in the school system, because it is not,
Right.
it's a
It is
completely,
very different. And
exactly.
I think a lot of entrepreneurs, I don't know that they're always thinking in these terms, but I think they get this.
Right.
Most of the business owners I know, or people running companies, they all understand what happens when decisions they made or the environment moved in a way,
Yeah.
and now they're not sure how they're going to make payroll.
Yeah.
And they understand people's mortgages are on the line. People have got, medical bills. They understand that about their employees.
Hmm.
And most of my clients will tell about all kinds of sleepless nights
Hmm.
where they're worried about not just how the business will do, but about the welfare of their employees. And so, I mean, that's sort of this application to it where, you may be running a small company with a dozen employees, but your decisions still impact their entire life.
Exactly. And I'm glad you brought that up because that brings me to another thing I want to talk to you about because you mentioned being a strength coach at a gym. Now, me personally, I have been a part of six different gym franchises, and all six of these gyms have gone under. They are no longer in business, permanently closed. And I could have called it out while I was there because these
Yeah.
owners were doing the opposite. There was absolutely zero leadership in regards to how they managed it and thinking about, the employees and stuff like that. But what remains consistent is like you had mentioned, the athletes, or even if it's the person that wants to come in and get into shape, they have a commitment level that makes it so you can kind of work around the lazy owner, you can work around these superiors. So when you're in that situation and you've lived through what you lived through, and now you're at this gym and you're seeing athletes or people coming in, can you walk us through a little bit about your experience there and when you ultimately decide to say, hey, let me transition into more intellectual property and, doing the book
Yeah.
work, consulting work, and things like that?
At the same time I was doing that,
Mhm.
most of my work was in consulting. So I was doing the strength training on the side. It was like basically what happened. I was attending a class,
Mhm.
a very, very intense class taught by the fitness instructor for our fire department.
Oh.
And
Oh, you had
I
to actually
and
do the workouts. It wasn't like just, yeah. Those
Oh,
are,
it was tough. It was hard. And I thought, wow, I loved how he could push people to their limits, but still
yeah.
be very encouraging and kind of get the best out of people. So just because I was already doing what I do now, I
Mhm.
thought I'm interested in his ability. So that was part of why I wanted to be there for the class itself, but also I just wanted to see how he was able to push people so hard without discouraging them. And
Well, I used to do that too. I like purposely and just watch the instructor kind of pick their brain on how I could, be a better instructor.
yeah, yeah. And so anyways, one day he left on a long trip and asked me to fill in on to substitute lead the class for him.
Oh, good.
And so I just started doing that and he never came back. Or he didn't come back for a long time. So by at that point the
Oh,
gym just asked me to keep teaching the class.
wow.
And so it was all very informal. In terms of my relationship with gym leadership and
Mhm.
it didn't really matter to me because all of that was a side thing,
Right.
and I just taught because I loved it.
Mhm.
I loved the dynamics of it. I loved working with athletes. I loved it was just fun for me. It was actually a good break from my normal
Right.
trying to run my business and make it go. But yeah, that was a gym that is still around. It's still successful in terms of like it being able to provide its service. But yeah, it was started by a group of people that were passionate about athletics,
Mhm.
not real interested in business. And
Well,
so it struggled
mhm.
on the backside, but I was separated enough where most of that didn't bother me.
Now, when you talk about, so you're kind of seeing two worlds though. Now you're seeing, you're seeing the business folks and the people that you're doing your consulting work with.
Right.
What were some of the trials and tribulations or the common themes that you see in them that made it so they needed your work? Like I know a lot of business folks, there's a lot of entrepreneurs that listen to the show, and certain things that they don't, fire themselves from, or they try to do too much, or like what were you helping them kind of see the blind spots in their business? Which is again, I like you have hired a coach myself. I think it's important for everyone, regardless. You got to find people that are going to tell
Yeah.
you something that you need to be improving on. So, what were some of the things that you were seeing in them that made it?
And I agree with the need. I mean, I am a coach. I've been doing this for decades, and I still always have at least one. Sometimes I have two coaches that I'm working with
Mhm.
on different things, just because I think that's important.
Right.
But I mean, so I don't like personally to look at owners and look for pain points. I know that's a strategy for marketing and sales. I don't
Mhm.
like it though, because I find that people will only move to the point of not feeling pain and then they tend to stop. And that doesn't really propel people that far forward. What I
Hmm.
get really interested in and the gap that I pay attention to is what's the vision of the leader that I'm talking to, and where's the gap between where they're at right now and the vision that they want to accomplish, which
Hmm.
may not always feel like pain to them, but it can feel like frustration or disappointment or feeling despair or disillusionment or whatever, or just tired.
Yeah.
And I mean, in practicality, when you get down to it, it's a lot of the same things where people struggle with, and it's what I talk about at the beginning of the book. It's really self-management. They
Hmm.
struggle with knowing how to delegate well, knowing how to prioritize well, knowing how to, um, yeah, I mean, those are really the two big things is how do you give away work so that you're not just creating a job for yourself, for small businesses,
Hmm.
and how do you really start to not just trust people, but build systems that make it easier to trust people?
Hmm.
Because not all trust is just about me feeling like I trust you.
Hmm.
In business, you also need to have systems that help me from a distance
Right.
be able to check in and see, are you performing?
Yes. Now, in the decades that you've been doing this, and actually that point, I want to make sure I reemphasize that point when it comes to the pain, because that is a strategy, and leading with pain is going to get you a lot of money right now, but then the result on the back end of it isn't necessarily going to be successful because you led with pain, and when they stop feeling that pain, ultimately that result may not be there. So that point, yeah, that point about not leading with pain, not a lot of business owners really get that, or people that are selling stuff to business owners really understand that sometimes that's not necessarily the best strategy. But the gap that you're talking about in regards to their vision, that frustration is there and it can feel like pain. And in your decades of doing this, how do you help them fill that gap? Because I'd imagine, 20 years ago when you started, there was no AI, there was no internet, there was no Zoom, and stuff like, things that are now can be a distraction to a business owner, and they don't
Yeah,
necessarily know how to adjust or, kind of move with all new forms of technology.
sure. Well, it really depends. Each
Mhm.
situation is specific. So what I do is I start out and try to make sure I understand what their vision is and their specific context. So if I'm working with a $500 million company,
Mhm.
it's a very different kind of conversation in some ways
Yes.
than working with a $5 million or 500. Well, I don't usually work with that much smaller, but as they get smaller, you have different kinds of conversations and what they need. But what I find generally across the board is the challenge that most leaders have is getting overwhelmed with all of the information, opportunities, challenges, demands, questions, problems, fires that need to be put out, and helping them learn to focus, helping them learn to create, in a sense, a firewall between all of the emergencies that are happening in the business and being able to actually strategically lead a
Right.
business.
Mhm.
And so, whether I approach that via coaching the individual or coaching a leadership team, or whether I'm helping them with building and implementing a strategic plan, I mean, there's a lot of tools that might be used,
Mhm.
um, depending on their needs. But I find that that's really one of the most common ones. The other one I think is for organizations that are growing, uh, they all will build a culture, but most leaders aren't aware of how to intentionally craft a culture and lead a culture.
And
And when you learn how to do that,
He
you
said,
can
he
begin
said
to scale.
most, folks. He said most. I want to make sure he said most. So this is something that is huge. That culture is so, so very important. I didn't mean to cut you, but I mean, these things have to be emphasized to you guys. That culture piece is something that you have got to implement within your organization. I cannot stress the importance of that.
Yeah, it is big because when you have a strong and culture means, or at least a way to define it for this conversation is when you have alignment around values and understanding how those values are translated into decision making and into behavior.
Yep.
And when everybody has the same understanding of what do we value together and how do we make decisions with that and how do we behave, whether we're doing sales, whether it's customer service, whether it's production, whether it's whatever we're doing, um, we all know what that looks like
Hmm.
in our space. Then you can really grow. Your management load goes down because everybody, even if you haven't written a policy, even if you haven't given them direction, they understand here's how we do these kinds of things. Here's how we make decisions in that space. And it starts to free up leaders to not spend time on little problems, but to focus on bigger issues.
Yes.
And it allows them to scale. It's not the only thing that's needed, but I find because it's squishy, it's hard to see, it's hard to get your hands on,
Mhm.
that a lot of times leaders build accidental cultures and they don't know how to build or actively craft them on purpose. And when you do learn that, your ability to scale and to grow becomes pretty significant.
Yeah, and it's crazy because it's almost like we're coming full circle. It goes back to what you had mentioned before about there's no manual on how to lead. People just kind of are thrown out into the water as like get your feet
Well,
wet.
there is now.
Well, yeah,
I
well,
wrote
that's
a
just,
book on it.
before you, there wasn't a manual, and this is why I wanted to make sure I mentioned that. And it's great, and I brought it up because when you really are focused, guys, and you're focused on what you're doing, you really see. Because I'm thinking back to when you're in these places and you're building these homes for these people, and you're doing this curriculum for the preschool kids. It goes back to these same principles to where, man, when it comes to teaching this stuff, it really boils down to all the answers are right in front of you. All the answers are in what you actually see. And you sort of already mentioned this, but when it comes to like your ideal person, the person that you would love to work with, you had mentioned not necessarily working with too small of a company or too big of a company. Can you kind of just describe who your ideal client is, just in case they're listening and they want to work with you further?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I would say, I mean, at the very, very core, I love working with, and this would be similar to like who I love coaching. I love coaching very motivated people
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
that really wanted to get somewhere. I didn't care if they were already, a college athlete or if they weighed 400 pounds and they just really, really wanted to get to where they wanted to go. I loved working with people that were highly motivated. So that's like at the core. In
Right.
terms of like profile of business, I
Mhm.
find that most of my sweet spots probably in the, companies that are doing at least 10 or 20 million up to around, you know, 3 to 500 million. Because in that space, on the low end, they usually have enough activity that it makes sense for me to be involved.
Yes.
And they're building structure up to that point, up when they get into the mid nine figures.
Hmm.
Um, so that's where I do most of my work is in that space.
Yes.
I have clients that are on either side of that, but I just find that that's sort of a sweet spot.
No, well, not only that, there's also I was actually checking out your website before we started doing this, and you have blogs as well. You have, free resources. You have actual resources for anybody that's
Tons
really
of free resources.
that's
Yeah.
actually motivated. And the reason I'm making sure I'm making this point clear is because, yes, we're talking business, but like I've mentioned to you regular listeners have heard this before, but to you newcomers, I'm going to tell you now, when you're focused on business, when you focus the right way in business, it helps with your personal life. It helps with your family life. It helps do a
Yes.
lot of things that you would
Yes.
want to do. So just even gravitating to the free resources is going to help improve your principles as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I would encourage people if you're looking for content around leadership, around building value in a company, about teams, about conflict resolution, about any of those kinds of things. I have tons of free resources on that, and so definitely take advantage of it.
Yes.
The and that comment you made about the personal development side, it really is true. And it's a core concept that I have in this book, which is you can only lead out of who you are. And
Yeah.
so if you're a leader, I think it becomes then a personal obligation to work on yourself.
Okay.
Because if you're someone that struggles with whatever it is, self-confidence or patience or anger or trust issues or anxiety or whatever the things are, that will show up in your business along with your family. And business, because it tends to create stress, becomes a great place to expose places where you need to get stronger.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I love working out with kettlebells, and in the kettlebell
Mm-hmm.
world, they'll a lot of times say the weight is the best instructor. So if you're having a hard time with form on something, you don't always get this with barbells, but with kettlebells, often say like go up a weight because it'll force you to get your form right.
Right.
And there's something about business that as you take a risk or you step forward, you'll discover because of that additional stress, like we either were set up for this or we weren't.
Yeah.
And we either now build the team or we start writing the policy or we start structuring ourselves, or
Yeah.
I get myself together and I figure out what really is the important thing here. So I'm not confusing my team.
Mm-hmm.
You'll start to notice those things. And so I think business is a fantastic and leadership's a fantastic opportunity for personal development, but it also requires it.
Yes, and we are, for those of you who are listening, we are recording this about a week now from the election, which again, we choose quote unquote leadership. But what I can tell you is that it can be scary, guys. It can be scary because often when you step into these leadership roles, you're gonna lose some friends. You're gonna lose, there are gonna be people in your life that were in your life that weren't in your that not gonna be in your life once you've stepped into this leadership role, or if you realize, hey, you're growing up and it's time for you to make the responsible decision. But that's where you said the personal development piece comes in, and it's your obligation. Cannot stress
Yeah.
that enough. It is your responsibility. Understand when you're making these decisions, people's salaries on the line, how they feed their families, how they pay their bills. All of this stuff is on your shoulders at this point, and you got to be making the right decisions and thinking about the folks that really need to that really depend on you. So, all that being said, I do want to be very respectful of your time and give you the opportunity to talk about your book a little bit and a little bit about what's next, what you see coming down the pipeline. I'll kind of give you the mic to speak on that a little bit.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Well, yeah, the book Train to Lead, it's my third book, and this one I wrote. Part of it was inspired by conversations I've had in executive coaching, like what seemed to be common themes.
Yes.
But a lot of it came from what I mentioned earlier in our conversation was, is there a way to structure leadership development so that somebody who is really trying, someone listens to this podcast and they're like, okay, I want to figure this out, that there's a clear path for them to follow. Because I haven't written the first book on leadership. There's just thousands of books on leadership out there. But the biggest problem with them is a lot of good content, but people don't always know, like, how do I actually use that idea? Or are some of these concepts dependent on my ability to do something else? So,
Mm-hmm.
for example, my ability to be very effective at strategic planning and implementing my vision, really that's dependent on my ability to manage some of my own self-identity and work on some of those issues, as well as my ability to manage my priorities and time. If I can't do that, it's going to be hard for me to manage a larger strategy. And so I walk people through a very manageable, very simple, very doable process where they can begin to learn all of the core leadership concepts that you need
Mm-hmm.
to be able to be effective in your role, and in a way that's accessible, whether you're a beginning leader or whether you're very experienced in leadership, but realize maybe you want to tune up a few areas. So that's what that book's about. Um, Coming down the pike, I mean, right now for the next while, I'm going to be, encouraging people to find the book and promoting it. But I'm got another couple of books that I'm interested in. I love creating content, and so I think a book that I do a lot of work in the exit planning space, and that's a whole other story. Part of my work is in M&A and exit work now. So just helping people build value in their businesses. And so I'm interested in writing a book around how do you take a business and make it a very valuable asset, not just a job, and
Right.
something that you can actually turn around. And when you're ready, you can sell for what you want and for the terms that you want.
Yeah, actually, no. That's what I was gonna ask you because I have a former colleague. He was a trainer and he was thinking about getting his own gym, and he actually took the mentality of maybe I'll build something to get bought out. Like he was thinking
Yeah.
about, yeah, building something and then eventually get bought out by Gold's Gym. He never did it, but just the concept in itself is building something that you know you're gonna sell at some point. So
Yeah.
that
We all leave our businesses. Nobody
exactly
lives forever. And so
exactly.
just being aware, whether it's 20 years from now or you have a 5-year exit strategy,
Mhm.
just thinking about what actually makes something valuable to a potential buyer.
Yep.
And this is a kind of an aside thing, but it's interesting how many businesses I've met where the owners are making personally take home millions of dollars a year
Hmm.
and nobody will buy the business. I mean, it's printing cash for the owners, but
Hmm.
it's structured in such a way that potential buyers won't be
Wow.
interested in it.
Wow. Man,
So understanding
yeah,
some of
that
those,
actually how does that happen though? Because now you got me think how would maybe I'm trying to think of a scenario. I don't know if that would yeah, walk us through that a
oh,
little bit. Yeah, how does that
yeah, yeah. So that happens when, I mean, there's a number of factors to it,
yeah,
but two primary ones, and one we've already touched on in the conversation is if an owner if the business is dependent on the owner's presence or activity to
yeah,
function well or
right.
grow, a buyer sees that and they say, well, what am I buying if you leave?
Hmm.
I mean, I'm simplifying that a little
Right.
bit, but
Now I've
basically, if
seen
the
that a
owner
lot. Yeah,
had,
a
so if
lot of
I wanted to buy a business that you built,
hmm
and you've built it in such a way where you can take a 3-month vacation and the business will probably grow while you're gone.
hmm
That's a valuable business.
That's a
But if
yeah.
you have to be there to understand how to operate the machinery and to get the team to do this and
Hmm.
where everything's filed at, chances are low because I know that if you go away or I write your check and you're gone, I have to somehow figure out how to do all of that. And that isn't necessarily what I want to do as an investor. And so that's one of the main reasons. The other real big reason is financial management. It's not sexy sounding,
Hmm.
but if you can't produce accurate books,
That are proven.
buyers,
All
that's
right.
the end of the conversation.
They want
So,
they
like anybody out there that's listening, that's running a business,
Mhm.
one of your very first, uh, probably outside hires you need to have is a good bookkeeper
Yes.
who can actually have current books and then find somebody. Go online, there's tons of resources and learn very basic ability to read your financial statements and start managing your business off of your money.
Yes.
Um, which is a skill I would say fewer than, maybe only 10 or 15% of the business owners I meet actually know their finances.
Yeah, that's not actually why they got in business. Most likely, this was come from
Not,
a passion. So
it's not.
I'll
But
leave
if you
that.
don't understand it, you're going to create problems for yourself. Ultimately, you may not be able to sell something that's treating you well right now.
Yes, and I'll leave you guys with three words: ROI, 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 ROI. All right, it stands for return on investment. If you are considering it, that's what the prospective buyer is going to want to know all about. Is where are they getting the return? So if you start thinking like that earlier on, it makes it so you actually pay attention and you stay up on these things. All right. So before I let you go, can you just tell people a little bit about how they can get in touch with you and where do you normally send
Sure.
folks?
Yeah, the best place to get me is on my website, www.christianmuntean.com.
Mhm.
Tons of free resources. You can sign up for a weekly email where I write about leadership topics, and it's basically what I talk about in my coaching conversations with clients.
Mhm.
And there's a blog, and you have access to, and you can reach out to me through the website as well.
All right. And the final thing I do, Christian, to close out all the shows is I want you to use your imagination a little bit. You are back, let's say, you're back helping with some disaster relief. You're in a situation now where they ask you to go, fix something. You don't know, you've never done it before. Just pretend that that version of Christian is coming to the Zoom room. Give him some words of encouragement, and we will officially close.
Yeah, that's good. That was pretty much my whole experience was something I'd never done before. Um, well, I think the encouragement would be it's going to be okay.
Mhm.
Like you're going to figure it out.
Yes.
And then I think the advice is to stay humble and graceful when you're stressed and frustrated.
Mhm.
Stay humble and graceful. I think all of the mistakes I made during that time were due to an issue of one of those two things.
Yes, I mean, I very rarely am I at a loss for words on this show, but I don't think have anything more to add than that. The humility and being graceful about being a leader or just being asked to do something in a leadership role is something that can easily be taken for granted because again, it's not something, it's never going to be real sexy work, never going to be work that you're going to be necessarily praised for, but you in your heart know you did something to help somebody else, something really, really small. So all that being said, fellow teammates, continue to move swiftly. We will talk more soon.